Hello everybody. Welcome to my new video. Today, I will be benchmarking CPU and GPU performance using Arch Linux in various computing applications. For this purpose, a minimalistic DWM window manager install will be used. I will start benchmarking the system with native Linux applications like Blender and Unigine benchmarks for GPU. Then I will move over to Windows-only Cinebench, our 23 CPU benchmark. Lastly, I will test some games. All Windows applications will be run using Wine compatibility layer. The laptop computer that I am running Arch Linux on has an Intel dual-core, hyper-threaded i5-7200U CPU, running at a maximum frequency of 3.1 GHz with an integrated UHD 620 graphics processor. Also, this laptop has a dedicated NVIDIA graphics processing unit GeForce GTX 940MX. I will test this GPU at stock clocks, as well as overclocked. I added 135 MHz to core clock and 800 MHz to memory clock. Finally, the testing laptop has 8 GB of DDR4 RAM running at 2133 MHz. Also, a word about software. I am using Arch Linux with a minimalistic DWM window manager. Linux kernel is version 5.16.13. At the end of the video, I will show some benchmarks with a customized kernel, tailored to my specific system, and will compare these results with the results achieved on a standard kernel. Now it is time for benchmarks. First is Blender benchmark for both CPU and GPU. For Blender render test, I chose to use BMW Car Demo by Mike Pan. In this Blender rendering performance benchmark, CPU rendering was the slowest. Intel Core i5-7200U CPU rendered the BMW car image in 17 minutes and 23 seconds. The NVIDIA GeForce GTX 940MX, on the other hand, rendered the same image in 4 minutes and 55 seconds. When overclocked, the render time decreased to 4 minutes and 17 seconds, which is a speed improvement of about 13%. Now I will be going to some CPU-only benchmarks. First I will start with the Cinebench 15 benchmark. Cinebench is a real-world cross-platform benchmark for evaluating computers' hardware capabilities. Using Cinebench 15, one can test GPU performance, running an OpenGL technology, multi-core and single-core CPU performance. Now to the results. OpenGL score using GTX 940MX GPU was 68.71 frames per second. The multi-core score of my hyper-threaded dual-core i5-7200U CPU was 301 Cinebench points. On a single thread, this CPU scored 126 points. Next one is Cinebench 23. It is an updated version of Cinebench 15 benchmark. In this benchmark, one can only test multi-core and single-core performance of any given CPU. Again, my dual-core hyper-threaded i5-7200U CPU scored 1744 points on a multi-threaded test and 778 points on a single-thread performance benchmark. Another benchmark that I have done is FryBench CPU benchmark. It is a benchmark designed to showcase the Fry render engine and its capabilities. The benchmark render scene is a glass of water with a green, nature-oriented background. The render on my dual-core, hyper-threaded i5-7200U CPU finished in 10 minutes and 58 seconds. Last CPU benchmark that I have done is POV-Ray, or the Persistence of Vision Ray Tracer benchmark. POV-Ray is a high-quality, free software tool for creating stunning three-dimensional graphics. The render of POV-Ray's default benchmark scenery with highest settings at 1920 by 1080 resolution took 32 minutes and 50 seconds to complete on my dual-core hyper-threaded Intel Core i5-7200U CPU. Now I will go to review some of the GPU benchmarks that I have done. First GPU benchmark that I ran was Unigine Heaven benchmark. In this benchmark, I tested both integrated Intel UHD 620 GPU and discrete NVIDIA GeForce GTX 940MX GPU. The latter was tested at both stock and overclocked speeds. The integrated Intel GPU scored an average of 3.5 frames per second and 88 points. NVIDIA GeForce GTX 940MX averaged 8.8 frames per second and scored 222 points at stock speeds. Overclocking the GPU gave a performance boost close to 15%. The average FPS up to 10.1. Next GPU benchmark is Unigine Valley. It is a newer Unigine benchmark than Heaven and has a different scenery. Maximum graphical settings with full HD resolution were used in this benchmark. The integrated Intel UHD 620 GPU averaged 3.1 frames per second and scored 128 points. Discrete NVIDIA GeForce GTX 940MX GPU averaged 8.9 frames per second and scored 373 points. When overclocked, the average FPS count up to 10.2 frames per second and total soaker got a 15% uplift to 429 points. Last synthetic GPU benchmark that I ran was Unigine Superposition. This is the newest GPU benchmark from Unigine. The benchmark was conducted on 1080p resolution with medium settings. The integrated Intel UHD 620 graphics processing unit scored 555 points and averaged 4.15 frames per second. NVIDIA GeForce GTX 940MX scored 1366 points and averaged 10.22 frames per second at stock clocks. When overclocked, benchmark score reached 1565 points and average frame rate got a 14.5% uplift to 11.71 FPS. Now we are done with synthetic GPU and CPU benchmarks. Now it is the time for some gaming benchmarks. In gaming benchmarks, I have only tested the discrete NVIDIA GPU, both at stock and overclocked. First gaming benchmark that I conducted was Battlefield 3. I have played a part of the first mission of the game. At stock settings, the game was somewhat stuttery with 0.1% low at 3.9 frames per second and 1% low at 16.6 FPS. The average was 35.3 frames per second. When overclocked, 0.1% low up to 18.6 FPS, 1% low got an uplift to 23.9 frames per second, and the average frame rate got to 41.6 FPS. Next game used for gaming performance test is Sniper Elite 3. Sniper Elite 3 is a stealthy third-person shooter. Playing on a 1920 by 1080 resolution with medium settings, NVIDIA GeForce GTX 940MX had 0.1% minimum of 13.2 frames per second, 1% minimum of 17.9 frames per second and averaged 32.2 FPS. When overclocked, the discrete NVIDIA GPU got a 0.1% minimum of 13.8 frames per second, 1% minimum of 17.5 frames per second and averaged 36.9 frames per second. Next game that I have tested is NBA 2K17. It is a basketball game centering around NBA League. In this game one can play with various roles within the basketball team. Playing on full HD resolution with medium settings, the discrete NVIDIA GeForce GTX 940MX GPU with stock settings achieved 0.1% lows of 7.8 frames per second, 1% lows of 12.5 frames per second and averaged 44.7 frames per second. When overclocked, 0.1% lows increased to 8.5 FPS, 1% lows got to 13.4 FPS and average went to 43.2 FPS. Now it is the time to once again showcase my non-existent skills at Counter-Strike Global Offensive against easy bots in a 10-minute deathmatch game. Playing Counter-Strike Global Offensive at full HD resolution with low settings allowed the NVIDIA GeForce GTX 940MX GPU, running at stock speeds, to achieve 0.1% low of 17.1 frames per second, 1% low of 20.6 frames per second, and an average of 58.7 frames per second. When overclocked, the 0.1% low increased to 17.5 frames per second, 1% low increased to 21.9 frames per second, and average frame rate got an 8% uplift to 63.3 frames per second. Finally, after gaming benchmarks, let's go to some CPU benchmark results with updated Linux May 16, 15 kernel. While the technical details about making a custom kernel and its tailoring to any given machine is a topic for another video, with my customized kernel I was not able to get a significantly better results, as both Cinebench tests that I ran with my customized kernel gave results that were within the margin of error of those captured when testing with a standard kernel. That said, thank you for watching this video until the end, and I hope you got some insight of gaming on Linux. Until next time.